Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku found hope in a dragon part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. So let's start the video. Sorry kid, I just don't think it's possible for you to be a hero. The words of All Might echoed through the mind of Izuku Midoriya as he walked with his head down, barely even noticing the sound of crumbling leaves or breaking twigs as he walked down the forest path. Night had fallen, the full moon above bathing the forest that surrounded him with its pale light. If he were to just raise his head a little, he could see the countless stars shining brightly above. But that seemed impossible now as he dragged himself forward with his back hunched by the weight of his hero's rejection as he continued to move with no real destination in mind. How long had he been walking now? Since that talk, his body seemed to move on its own with his mind in a haze. He could recall getting on a train and only getting off when they reached the last stop, the end of the line. Yeah, kind of felt fitting for him right at this moment. He had been dragging his feet with all his might, moving towards that dream of becoming a hero his entire life. But no one believed in him. Not the people he once thought of as friends. Not his mother who had just wept and apologized. Not even his hero thought there was a chance. It's not wrong to have dreams, repeated the words of All Might when he had walked away, leaving Izuku just standing there with his head down on the roof of a random building. Just make sure they're realistic. Yeah, I guess I knew all along, said Izuku, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke into what seemed like the empty forest around him. I really am pathetic. All I've been doing my entire life is fooling myself into thinking. Izuku's words trailed off as he found himself unable to even finish the sentence, his throat becoming dry. Glancing over to his side, Izuku saw a sign warning him of dangerous animals living in this area. The fear that should have gripped his heart, forcing his feet to turn around, never came. No, he oddly felt calm as he continued his walk. After all, what was the point? It wasn't like there was a new dream for him to pursue. Despite what All Might had said, Izuku doubted he could ever be a police officer, a paramedic, or a firefighter. They would take one look at his quirkless status before coming to the same conclusion as the heroes, that there wasn't any point in even letting him try, as they would see him as a liability. Not to mention that statistically, a quirkless person was more than 80% more likely to be denied a job compared to someone who did, even when said quirkless person was more qualified. Quirks were everything. It was just how society worked. They really didn't have any need for someone like him. Then, another memory flashed through the teen's mind from that day, one that had been on Izuku's mind the entire train ride. If you want a quirk so badly, take a swan dive off the school roof and hope that you'll be born with one in the next life, Kaken had said, with no one around to say he had gone too far. Like they agreed with him. An animalistic growl up ahead could be heard, clearly from something big. Despite that, Izuku continued forward. Maybe this would be it. If he got attacked by this or any wild animal, then at least he would be sparing others the horror of seeing his dead body. That, as well as providing some food to some hungry animals, so he would at least be helping them. The only thing that Bakugo's suggestion had over this was that it would be a quick death. Besides, it wasn't like there was anyone waiting for him back home anymore. After several long minutes, Izuku bumped into something. Finally lifting his head, his dulled eyes sprang back to life as he beheld something that warped everything he knew. On the ground before him was a dragon. Massively it towered over him, its jaws slightly open to show that it could easily eat him with a single bite. Looking up at its green scales, the boy saw trickles of red blood running downward caused by a massive sword stuck in the creature's side. Taking a step back, Izuku wondered if this was a hero or a villain. But as far as he knew, the only dragon-like hero out there that could become a dragon was Ryukyu. And she didn't look like this at all. Human, out of what hole did thou crawl? Upon hearing that voice, a trembling Izuku looked up to see that the creature's yellow eyes with red slits were now glaring at him. He could see it, the same loathing contempt that was always present in Bakugo's eyes, that he was nothing more than an annoying bug to this creature. Depart, insolent human, otherwise I shall eat you. As if to punctuate this statement, the dragon sent out a blast of air from its maw so powerful that Izuku was flung onto his back. Several times he rolled in the dirt and leaves until he came to rest on his stomach. The teen winced in pain, looking up to see if the dragon would rise to make good on its promise, or to see if flames were filling its mouth, ready to cook its meal first. Instead, it just seemed to lay there for a moment before turning its head to look over at the blade in its side. Alas, I am going to die. How tragic is it that the last being I met is a pathetic human. As the dragon spoke, its eyes began to close slightly while lowering its head to the ground. At the same time, something about the resignation in the creature's tone sparked something in the green-haired teen. Before he even knew what he was doing, the young man had rushed over to the dragon's side and was now climbing the dragon's scaly body. What are you doing? roared the dragon as it felt Izuku climbing its body, its eyes becoming round, white circles. "Cease climbing me at once. I'm going to pull that out," grunted Izuku. The teen almost slipped as he spoke. Thankfully, he managed to catch himself at the last moment before gravity could return him to the forest floor. The dragon watched him nearing the large blade. Its jaw opened slightly. "You fool," it cried out. "Don't even try. If a mortal were to touch God's sword, then their mind will be torn." Izuku, however, ignored the dragon's words as his red shoes pressed against the green scales, pushing him upwards. By the time he had reached the top of the dragon's back, he could feel himself panting heavily. He could feel sweat gathering on his back between his shoulder blades and moving down, so much that it caked the dirt that had clung to it. Izuku also became aware of the number of cuts on his clothing, caused either from when he had been rolled backwards by the dragon's breath or from the sharpness of the scales. At least his hands weren't bleeding, though they were a little red. Still, regardless of his state, he had made it to the top. After wiping his sweaty brow with his sleeve, Izuku turned and began walking over to the blade. Now that he was closer, he could see that it was far taller than he was. Heck, it was bigger than All Might when he was all muscular. But he pushed that to the side while standing before it, reaching his hands out as far as he could just so that he could grip the sides. With a grunt, he began to push upwards with all his might, clearly struggling with the attempt. His teeth gritted tightly, even more sweat pouring down his face and back as he called upon every bit of strength he could muster and then some. "Why?" asked the dragon in disbelief. "Would you not obtain a greater prize by claiming my hide? Why risk your soul and mind?" Izuku grunted a bit as he continued to push the blade out. As he did, he could hear the voices he had known his entire life. He could hear Cat and Back when they were children, laughing at him before proceeding to beat him up for trying to stand up to him. He recalled the voices of the teachers back in preschool, the voices of the parents. He remembered how Bakugo had lashed out at him earlier today, sending the poor boy out of his seat and screaming at him to not even bother trying to take the UA entrance exam, all while the class laughed at him and their homeroom teacher did nothing. Then came All Might's words once more telling him to be realistic. Izuku heard all of these things in his mind one after the other, putting him down and telling him to just give up. But Izuku's arms never loosened their hold on the blade as it began to budge. Rather, he continued with all his might. "Because ... you look ... like you need ... help," Izuku managed to say through gritted teeth. It was then that the sword finally exited the dragon's body as it flew up and into the air. At the same time, Izuku fell backward with a smile on his face, watching as the blade dissolved into stardust before hitting the ground with a thud. "I give you my thanks, human," said the dragon, its voice already sounding stronger. "Without your assistance, I would have died, though you are still weak and inferior." Slowly, Izuku got into a sitting position with his head downcast. "Yeah, I get that a lot," Izuku replied. Suddenly, the dragon began to glow red so brightly that it caused Izuku to raise his head. The light was so bright that he had to raise an arm to shield his eyes. Like this, he could see that the dragon's form was no longer visible. Then the light began to shrink, compressing until it took on a more human shape. When it ended and the only glow came from the moon above their heads, a more human figure landed on the ground, causing Izuku to let out a cry as he quickly covered his eyes. "You're a girl," screamed Izuku. "Yes, I am female," said the dragon plainly as she stood there. The dragon woman then raised one of her human arms, parting the brown cloak that covered her body and making Izuku panic more. "Though I detest using this form, I thought it would put your mind more at ease seeing something that would more resemble your..." "That's not the problem. You're only wearing a cloak," Izuku screamed, doing his best not to look. The dragon tilted her head to the side, her oddly shaped horns sticking out of her long flowing blonde hair tipped with red. Blinking her red and orange eyes that had slit like pupils, she looked down at the dirty-looking cloak that covered her form in confusion while her thick green tail stuck out from the back. Clearly, she didn't understand what the problem was ... or didn't care as moving slightly caused some of her form hidden underneath the cloak to be revealed to the boy. Honestly, she was more curious that he was making more of a fuss over this than seeing a dragon. As for Izuku, he did his best to hide his blush while keeping his eyes focused above her neck. His tongue began feeling heavy at the thought that he was now talking to a girl. Sure, a girl dragon, but still a girl. Oh god, he had never talked to a girl before. "So human," began the dragon again as she sat on the ground. "Why are you up here in these mountains and not with the rest of your filthy kind?" Why do you want to know?" asked Izuku, his blushing face slowly becoming more controlled. "I suppose I'm just curious and have nothing better to do to pass the time," replied the dragon girl with a simple shrug. Figuring that was the best answer he could get at the moment, Izuku began his story. How he had always wanted to be a hero, saving people with a smile on his face like his hero. However, when his doctor told him he didn't have a quirk, the world began telling him it was impossible, starting with his mother. From there, he was seen as worthless. That's what the kids around his area used to call him, useless, and adults dismissed him just as easily. All of this leading up to today when the hero he admired more than anyone else said the same thing. To just give up. After that, I kind of just wandered here without really thinking about it. I just don't fit in anywhere, finished Izuku, a few tears forming in his eyes. You too. That caught the teen's attention. Looking at the dragon girl in surprise, he now saw that she was looking up at the sky with clear sadness in her eyes. A sadness so deep that it almost made him cry for reasons he didn't understand. I don't fit in anywhere either, admitted the dragon. I don't even have a place to go back to. Hearing that caused something to stir within Izuku. He tried to fight it, tried his best to hold it down. But the more he saw of the girl's mournful expression, the stronger that feeling became. So, nervously, he spoke. Would you like to stay with me? If you want, asked the boy. The girl's head snapped to look at him. Her eyes, which had been dull up until this point and looking down at him with disdain, suddenly changed. They widened as she stared at him before lighting up, tears forming. Then, as the moonlight began to shine more brightly upon her, the dragon smiled so warmly. Yes, I'd love to. Tears were leaking out of Izuku's eyes now as a wave of happiness struck him. Tonight, he had done it. He had saved someone in trouble and had brought a smile to her face. He did that all without a quirk. Maybe there was hope for him yet. Great. And don't worry about paying rent or anything, Izuku continued, waving his arms around as he spoke. But if you want to help out, you can do some stuff around the apartment, like a housekeeper or a maid, just so you don't feel like why you're taking advantage of me. A maid. That caused the dragon to take on a look as if she were remembering something before her eyes began to shine once more. The next morning, Izuku awoke with a start upon hearing a loud knock on the front door of the apartment, causing him to roll out of bed. Wincing in pain, the young man slowly lifted himself off the ground while still feeling the effects of a lack of sleep. It was honestly a little hard to keep his eyes open and kept feeling like his sense of balance was off. But despite this, he was still able to read the numbers on his all-night alarm clock telling him that he still had about an hour or so before he would need to head out for school. Hearing the knocking continue, Izuku slowly dragged his feet out of his bedroom and towards the front door. As he made his way through the empty apartment, he couldn't help but feel just how much the place had changed since his mother had left to join her husband in the States. Where there had once been a warmth that was present whenever he came home, the place now felt cold and lifeless even when he was here. It was now just a place where he went to hide from the rest of the world when it all became too much. The only one who ever seemed to check up on him was Mrs. Bakugo, which, given the amount of knocking, was probably her. At the very least, he kept it clean. With a yawn, he recalled the strange dream he had the night before, about finding a dragon in the forest and helping it out of a jam. A nice dream, but now he was back in reality. Soon he would have to go back to school and figure out how he was going to move on from his dream of being a hero. Opening the door, he was greeted by a sight that made his heart stop. It wasn't Mrs. Bakugo. Instead, Izuku saw the very recognizable head of the dragon he had thought had been but a dream was looking right at him. Her head filled his vision as she stared at him. A bright red flash of light later, and she was in her human form, now dressed in more proper clothing. A maid-style outfit now adorning her body. She smiled happily at him before speaking in a much cheerier tone. Good morning, Mr. Midoriya. Maid Toru reporting for duty. Izuku did not end up going to school that day. Also, he learned that Toru was not a girl with a dragon quirk, but instead a real dragon. It was kind of hard to ignore when the now super cheerful girl began demonstrating so many unusual abilities and behaviors that no single quick could explain. All right, Mr. Midoriya, Toru had said as soon as she was allowed inside the apartment. How can your wonderful, amazingly perfect maid assist you first? Would you like me to help you undress? As she said this last part, Izuku felt a shiver run down his spine as she licked her lips, that as well as giving him a look that no girl on earth had ever given him before. And no, Izuku said as he glanced down at what he wore to bed, a green short-sleeved shirt and All Might-themed boxers. How about you? Clean up the living room. Yeah, can you do that while I get changed? Oh, Mr. Midoriya, I'm good at cleaning, said Toru confidently as she placed a hand over her chest. Just watch and this room will be clean before you even set foot in your bedroom. Then, before Izuku's eyes, the girl opened her mouth to show that her normal, human teeth had been replaced with fangs that seemed too large for her body. But that was only the beginning as an orb of fire formed in her mouth. Izuku tried to shout, yet it was too late as Toru unleashed the cleaning attack. In less than a second, everything in the living room was gone. All the pictures, the furniture, the TV, his hard copies of All Might's interviews, and anything else along with the dirt was gone, leaving only a sparkling clean and empty room. How was that, Mr. Midoriya? Asked a proud Toru. She then turned to look at her master, finding the teen pressed against the wall with his hand over his heart. Mr. Midoriya, is something wrong? You look a little pale. You destroyed everything. Izuku managed to yell out, somehow this being the noise that got his downstairs neighbors to pound on their ceiling. One moment, Toru replied in a sing-song tone as she held out her hands. Before Izuku's eyes appeared two things that he had only ever seen in manga and read in light novels, magic circles. Both of them were red and each one was just hovering there in front of Toru's outstretched open palm. Before Izuku could even think to ask anything, everything in the room began to slowly reappear, like they were fading back into existence. "You can bring it back," stammered Izuku, his heart racing while his mind tried to process how this was possible. "Why yeah, sure, why not?" Then, when he noticed Toru watching him expectantly, the teen managed to give her a shaky smile. "Well, you cleaned the place so, gee, good job." "Oh, Mr. Midoriya," cried Toru, stunning the young teen as she placed her hands on her blushing cheeks. "Since you, got that done real quick, how about you?" Izuku's words trailed off as he tried his best to think of what to ask the dragon woman next. He needed something that would take her longer than a second to do so he could get dressed and get his thoughts in order due to all this craziness. Then, as he felt his stomach rumbling, he got an idea. "Breakfast. How about you make us breakfast?" "Leave it to me," replied Toru, giving Izuku a salute. After showing Toru to the kitchen, Izuku raced towards his room, doing his best not to slam the door behind him in the process. Quickly changing into one of his joke t-shirt shirts and jeans, he had begun doing his best to process what he knew about quirks. Everyone got one quirk, and while some of them looked like they had multiple quirks, they were always part of the same quirk. Gang Orca was a prime example. The pro hero not just looked like a mix of a human and an orca whale, but had all the powers of the killer whale as well. Things like being able to swim really fast, dive deep underwater, and use sonar all seemed like separate abilities, but they were all part of a singular quirk. With Toru, he could believe that she had a quirk that let her become a dragon and gain all of its fabled abilities. It would make sense that she could transform into one, fly, and even breathe fire. Yet, when she used the fire to clean the room, he hadn't noticed a single burn mark anywhere. It was like the flames were able to pick and choose what was incinerated. And then there were those magical circles that brought everything back. Those were things he couldn't explain. This left Izuku with one of two choices. One, he had to expand his thinking to believe that a person could have more than one quirks, and that person just so happened to be a dragon woman he found alone in the mountains with a giant sword sticking out of her side. A sword that just turned to dust after he pulled it out. Thinking about these other factors made option 2 all the more likely. That option being, Izuku's thoughts were cut off as he heard a loud explosion, calling out Toru's name in a panic. The teen raced out the room with the clothing he had slept in still in his hands. As soon as he was in the hallway, the teen could see the black smoke running over the ceiling. Heart pounding in even more fear, Izuku dashed into the kitchen to find Toru, thankfully alive and okay, coughing over the stove. "Toru, what happened?" asked a still panicking Izuku. Toru turned to look at him with a pout on her face, holding up the frying pan she had been using. Or, at least, what had once been the frying pan. The thing now looked like it had been both burnt and melted, with the middle of the pan completely gone. Slowly, Izuku's gaze shifted from the pan to the oven, causing his heart to stop. The surface of the stove was in a similarly bad state as the pan. It was charred and half melted down. "Sorry, Mr. Midoriya," said Toru. "I was worried that your pitiful human fire wouldn't be hot enough, so I decided to use some dragon fire. I ended up destroying the eggs I was making." As she finished saying this, she stuck out her tongue like she had made a silly little mistake that anyone else would have made. Then, she spotted his dirty clothing. "Allow me to take care of that for you, Mr. Midoriya," said Toru, sounding way too excited to be doing laundry. In a flash, she crossed the small distance between them, taking his clothes from him before shoving them in her mouth. "What are you doing?" yelled Izuku, watching as it looked like Toru was swirling his clothing in her mouth like mouthwash. "Using my saliva to clean your clothing," she managed to say without opening her mouth. It didn't help that she was also blushing like crazy while beginning to sway back and forth. Izuku surprised himself by not fainting. After that, Izuku decided that for the sake of his own well-being, he would have to spend time showing the girl, who he now fully believed was a real dragon, her way around the apartment. Mainly, this consisted of showing Toru where all the cleaning supplies were located, how to use them, setting her own user account on his laptop, and reassuring her that the stove would be enough to cook their meals. He especially showed her how to use the washing machine. As the afternoon drew near, Izuku decided to show Toru around the neighborhood so that she wouldn't get lost. Not that it was hard, as the dragon maid clung to his arm tightly as though they were a couple, the act causing his face to turn scarlet. Along the way, he spotted some workers at a maid cafe wearing the same outfit as Toru. "I needed to know what was considered proper maid attire in this world," Toru had said with a giggle when he brought it up. "So while I was flying, I spotted that place. I just sort of copied their uniform." At that, Izuku nodded, as he didn't have any issue where she got the outfit as long as she didn't steal it. And while he would never say it out loud, as it was far too embarrassing, he thought it suited her. As the pair turned a corner, they were greeted with a sight that made the young man's blood run cold. There, in the middle of the street, was a figure that was forever burned into Izuku's memory, the Sludge villain. Just looking at it brought back phantom sensations from yesterday. The green-haired teen trembled as he perfectly recalled the feeling of that green substance sliding over his body, restricting his movements before forcing its way down his throat. That sickening, mocking smile the villain gave him while thanking his victim and calling him a hero. The look in that monster's eyes that delighted in picking on someone who was helpless. When 𝗧𝗑 had shown Toru how to use the computer, he searched out one of his favorite hero news sites to use an example. It was there that he had read about the fate of the villain. Somehow, he had managed to escape from All Might after their talk. Even more surprising was that the villain had come across Bakugo, holding the teen hostage. Thankfully, a hero managed to show up in the nick of time with a quick suitable to deal with the Sludge villain. In the end, Bakugo was freed and then rushed to the hospital where he was reported to make a full recovery. As for the villain, he had managed to escape the heroes by fleeing into the sewers. Now, it seemed like the villain was doing the same thing again. As people ran past the pair, 𝗧𝗑 could only stare at the sight before him. There, within the hold of the Sludge villain, was the man 𝗧𝗑 had met the prior morning during Mount Lady's debut. The man with the weird antennae on his head that had called him a fanboy. He was now suspended in slime. Nothing more than hostage as the villain broke every ATM and vending machine he saw. A few police were on the scene, doing what they could to keep others at bay while trying to contact a hero. No doubt this was very recent. "Excuse me, Mr. Midoriya," came Toru's calm yet slightly confused voice, breaking his attention from the disaster before him. "Isn't our destination just down the street? If we want to make it there before the lunch rush, shouldn't we continue?" 𝗧𝗑 could only look at Toru at that moment, shocked by what he was hearing. But what he saw was simple confusion, as though she didn't understand the significance of what she was seeing. But then again, she did come from a different world. "There's a villain attack going on," managed to say. "So until a hero shows up to deal with it, then would it be alright if I dealt with this matter?" asked the Dragon Maid, sounding a little more cheerful, like she was eager to help. "It would be no trouble at all." 𝗧𝗑 felt his throat go dry as he knew he should tell her not to. That they had to wait for the heroes to show up and let them deal with them. That they would get in trouble if they tried, since neither of them had a license. And that was something that 𝗧𝗑 didn't want for Toru. For her to get in trouble while he just stood there on the sidelines. Then, he glanced back at the Sludge villain. Or, rather, the innocent hostage still in its grasp. He could still recall what it felt like when he had been in that situation. How it felt like he was going to die at any moment. That look in their eyes. "Okay," 𝗧𝗑 relented. "Please, be careful." "Right." With a salute, Toru seemed to blink out of existence before appearing right in front of the Sludge villain. The living pile of sludge barely had a chance to look down before Toru flicked a single finger at its chest, instantly causing it to splatter as the hostage fell to the ground. It had all been done so effortlessly that 𝗧𝗑's eyes widened in wonder and excitement, so much so that he was still beaming as his new maid returned to his side. "That was so amazing," cried 𝗧𝗑, his hands balled into fists in excitement. "Toru, you could be one of the greatest heroes in the world with power like that." "Oh, Mr. Midoriya," cried the Dragon Maid as a blush appeared on her cheeks. Her hands reaching up to cover them, she began to sway back and forth. "Please continue to praise and flatter me, even for something as minor as taking down such an inferior being as that." By that time, a crowd of onlookers who had stayed in the area began to encircle the two while the police went to work cleaning up the scene. For the next several minutes, Toru was showered with praise from the crowd, which she took in stride, laughing about how it wasn't a big deal. Then, before they could leave, a few of the officers approached Toru. After talking to her for a moment, it was clear that she didn't have a hero license. But seeing as no heroes showed up to help, as well as this was the first time she had done something like this, they told her that they would look the other way this time. Hearing that, 𝗧𝗑 let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding as the police walked away. Grinning, he turned to look at his new maid. "You did great back there. Though, I wish I didn't have to make you do it." "Oh, Mr. Midoriya," said Toru, the giddiness from earlier still in her voice as she spun around. "There is no need to trouble yourself over such minor inconveniences. Not when you have a superior being such as myself as your personal maid. It's ... well ... 𝗧𝗑 paused for a moment, trying to figure out the right way to say this. As the teen collected his thoughts, Toru kept her eyes on him with a smile on her face while ignoring the people around them. "Okay, I'm glad that man got saved," he finally said. "And that's the most important thing. It's ... just that I still feel like I'm using you to do the things I wish I could do myself." Toru blinked at that for a moment before a look of understanding filled her features. "Oh, I see," the Dragon Maid replied, pounding a fist into her other open-palmed hand. "You wish to smite that pitiful fool yourself. I understand. There is a certain joy that one feels when obliterating others with your own claws. Well, I wouldn't put it like that." For a moment, that was all 𝗧𝗑 could say as he looked away with a forced laugh. Scratching the back of his head, he couldn't help but think that 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 would have agreed wholeheartedly with the phrasing of that statement. "Well, as your loyal, beautiful, and most amazing maid in the whole wide world, it is my duty to help you then," said Toru, her statement surprising and confusing 𝗧𝗑. However, he didn't have a moment to ask what she meant by that as she grabbed his wrist to begin dragging him from store to store as they began what could only be called whirlwind shopping. It wasn't until dinner was served that night that Izuku discovered what Toru meant. On the kitchen table sat a bowl of rice with bits of meat on top of it that he certainly didn't recognize. Slowly he poked at it with his chopsticks several times before asking Toru what it was. "It's meat from my tail," replied Toru happily, the sound of a record skidding to a halt accompanying her. Hearing this caused the teen's mouth to drop in horror, his chopsticks falling to the ground. Looking down at her feet, he saw that, indeed, the tip of her tail had been cut off, with the insides looking a lot like the meat he was about to eat. "Why?" was the only thing Izuku could ask. "Oh, that's simple, Mr. Midoriya," giggled Toru, not seeming bothered by the fact that she had cut off a part of her own body, cooked it, and was now serving it to Izuku. "You said you wanted to become stronger, right? Well, this is how your amazing maid is going to help you. Tell me, does this world have stories about what happens when you eat the flesh of a mermaid?" Izuku blinked at this before replying. "That sounds familiar. Something to do with immortality." "Oh, is that how it goes in this world?" asked Toru, her smile fading as she looked at Izuku while her hands moved to her hips. "Sort of lame and boring, but I suppose that it can't be helped. You see, the human who eats the flesh of a mermaid doesn't become immortal. Instead, they gain a much longer lifespan because they become a mermaid. The same is true about dragon meat." Izuku gasped, his eyes widened in surprise when he heard this. "Now, don't get the wrong idea," continued Toru. "It isn't like it'll be eating a single meal and then poof, you're a dragon. You'll have to eat dragon's meat constantly every day for about a year. Missing just one day will kill you. So you will need a steady source of dragon meat as well as the dragon's consent so they can remove as much of the poison in their body. That's the best way an inferior human can survive the process. Believe me, I've seen plenty of foolish humans trying to munch on the bodies of dead dragons only to die as soon as the meat touched their unworthy tongues. There was even this king, who offered up everything he owned for a piece of dragon meat. He survived the first bite somehow, but died the next day. Still ... even if you have me by your side, there's no guarantee that this will work. There will still be poison in the meat, making you sick. That could kill you just as easily as the process. Also, you'll never be able to return to being a pitiful human again. Don't know why you would want to." Izuku looked down at the dish in front of him, watching as the steam rose while taking all this information in. He stared at it, the words of his doubters ringing in his ears. Then, he remembered Toru's smile in the moonlight. He wanted that. He wanted to make as many people smile like that as possible. And as he was now, that wasn't possible. If his dream wasn't worth risking his life, then what was the point? "I understand." With that, Izuku went to pick up his chopsticks. However, Toru was faster as she swooped them up as a playful smile returned to her face. And ... had her pupils turned into hearts. Carefully, she scooped up some of her tail meat along with the rice before placing it right in front of the teen's lips. "Then eat this," she said before feeding him. The next several months became nothing short of a living hell for Izuku Midoriya. After taking that first bite of Toru's tail, he began to feel the effects of what little poison it still contained. His body began breaking out into a cold sweat, his insides burning, stomach turning, a pounding in his head like rapid-fire machine guns going off, his throat going dry, the world spinning around him, and so much more. Yet the teen steeled himself before taking another bite. When he finally finished, Izuku nearly passed out as he fell to the floor with his clothing drenched in sweat. Things did not get any better as the night progressed. Laying on his bed, Izuku found it nearly impossible to fall asleep, spending the majority of the night tossing and turning on the bed. There would be moments when he felt like there was an inferno raging just underneath his skin, forcing him to toss off his blanket. Then, in the next moment, his entire body would feel like he had been walking in a freezer for the last several days despite being covered in sweat. Pain would shoot through his gut, forcing the teen to arch his back while screaming in pain. Sometimes the pain would almost paralyze him, making it so that Izuku could barely move his arm to clutch his chest as he screamed to the heavens. When daylight finally peeked through his curtains, Izuku was in a sorry state as his hair was matted with sweat while his eyes looked bloodshot with heavy bags underneath them. But despite this state, he felt glad that he didn't need to face it alone, as Toru had been by his side the entire night. In fact, he knew within his heart that had she not been there, he would not have survived this first night. Though tears swelled in the teen's eyes when Toru brought him some soup with her tail meat mixed in, the teen soldiered on and ate it. Needless to say, Izuku did not end up going to school that day. On the second day, a trembling Izuku managed to finally get some sleep, though it felt like he had only closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, standing over his bed with a concerned look on her face, was Mrs. Bakugo. Well, her along with two semi-transparent clones of the woman that were rotating around her. But he was pretty sure he was just seeing things. "Kid," began Mrs. Bakugo, a worried look on her face. "You look like shit." To that, Midoriya just gave a small smile as he didn't have the heart to argue with her. Partly because he didn't think that she would believe him if he said it wasn't so bad when he was in the middle of a puddle of his own sweat, and partly because his throat hurt from so much screaming the night before. After that, Mrs. Bakugo walked out of his room without another word to him. Toru, on the other hand, she had a lot to say too, and he could hear everything that Mitsuki Bakugo said as Izuku felt like the entire building could hear her given how much she was shouting. The mother of his childhood friend fully wanted to know who the hell she was, which was then quickly followed by demanding that Izuku be admitted to a hospital and see a professional. And given some of the curses that followed, he had assumed that Toru said no. Hearing that caused a few tears of happiness to roll down Izuku's face, knowing just how much the woman cared about him. Though you would have a hard time telling as they were mixed with his tears of pain, brought on due to the renewed pounding in his head caused by all the yelling. In the end, Mrs. Bakugo relented, most likely satisfied that Izuku had someone looking after his well-being 24/7, though she did say that she would be coming by to check on Izuku, and she demanded that Toru promise to call her if Izuku's condition worsened before taking him to a hospital. Needless to say, Izuku didn't go to school that day either, nor did he go to school for the rest of the week. On Friday afternoon, Katsuki Bakugo could be seen making his way towards the Midoriya apartment with a rare subdued expression on his face. The teen walked with his head down, hands in his pockets while wearing his school uniform. Every once in a while he would glance to the side where a door was, checking the door number with an expression that seemed almost out of place on the bomber boy's face. He lacked his signature savage smirk brimming with confidence as well as his angry sneer. Instead, he looked thoughtful with each step he took. The events of the week played in his head, starting with his capture by the slimy hands of that villain. Needless to say, that had been a major blow to his ego. Despite all the work he had done with his quirk, training with it and studying so that he could get into the very best hero school in the country, that nobody villain had managed to capture him within its disgusting body. Then, as if to make matters worse, when he had managed to regain consciousness, every explosion that he had unleashed trying to free himself had done nothing. Well, to the villain at least. The streets, cars, and maybe a hero or two were different stories. All he could do was just remain there, waiting for someone else to save him. He felt useless, probably how Deku felt every day. That thought caused Bakugo's stomach to turn in on itself, nearly causing the ashen blonde to trip. He still remembered what he had said to Deku before all that shit went down. How he told him that if he wanted a quirk so badly that he should jump off the roof and hope for a quirk in his next life. Afterwards, the two lackeys that hung around him said that he might have gone too far. Though he brushed it off at the time, even he knew they were right. Still, he reassured himself that there was no way a coward like Deku would ever go through with it. When he awoke at the hospital, he was surprised to see that Deku hadn't shown up. Nor did the nerd who had followed him around his whole life calling him by that childish nickname leave a card. And when he went to school, Deku wasn't there. None of the worthless extras there seemed to know what was going on with him. Deku was just gone. To be honest, that had made Katsuki worry. It was when he had gotten home that day that he sort of found out what was happening. According to his mom, Deku looked like he was at death's door, though the rest of the conversation became lost on him as the two began a screaming match. He couldn't remember most of the details besides some of his more colorful insults. But he did make sure to call her stupid for not dragging his worthless ass to a damn doctor. Then she hit him upside the head, yelling at her son to just shut his mouth and go visit Midoriya. After that, Katsuki just stormed into his room where he then fell onto his bed to stare at the ceiling. For several long hours, he ignored the world around him as he became lost in his own thoughts. What were the odds that Deku would get that sick right after he had told the nerd to off himself? Was it like in those stories he had heard about where the person becomes sick because they lost the will to live? Eventually, Katsuki just let out a growl before turning over as he did his best to shut out the voices in his head. If there was one thing that Katsuki knew, Deku was the most stubborn pebble he had ever stomped on. No matter what he said, no matter how many times he said it or blasted that worthless stain across a room, Deku refused to take the hint. So what made that time so different? Like there was anything anyone could say or do that could break the endless enthusiasm. Right now, here he was, bringing Midoriya all the assignments he had missed. Thinking about how he had been saddled with this shitty job brought back some of the familiar rage that Bakugo was used to feeling. He could still recall how their homeroom teacher had lazily stood at his desk, asking for a volunteer to deliver all these papers to Deku, doing it in the same tone that came when you were doing something you really didn't want to. The worthless extras in his class reacted in the same manner, no one caring at all for the nerd's plight while whining that they didn't want to waste their time delivering anything to him. Heck, there were rumors going around saying that the damned nerd had some sort of disease that only affected the quirkless and that if any of them approached him for too long then they would lose their quirk. But, in the end, the papers had to be delivered. And since Bakugo was one of the few people who knew where Midoriya lived, he had been volunteered for the shitty job. Finally, Bakugo arrived at his destination. Angrily, he slammed his fist on the door several times before looking down into his bag. He shifted through his own books and folders, eventually finding the large stack of assignments for Deku just as the door opened. No doubt it was that nerd having crawled out of bed. "Here's your assignments, you damn nerd," Bakugo half yelled, holding out the stack of papers without bothering to look at the person standing in the doorway. "And don't you dare go all sentimental on me, thinking I'm doing this because I like you or anything. The damn teacher forced me to since no one wanted to waste their time on your ass." When he felt someone taking the assignments, Bakugo finally decided to look up. It was then that his eyes widened, taking a few steps back as he beheld a woman with horns sticking out of her blonde hair and wearing a shitty cosplay maid outfit. As she gave him a confused look, tilting her head to the side as she did so, 1,000 questions ran through Bakugo's mind. Who was this? Is she some sort of helper that liked to dress like this? Or did that shitty nerd have some weird tastes beyond heroes? Why hadn't the old hag told him about her? Wait, maybe she did and it was lost during all of the yelling. Then, the shitty maid said something that caused Bakugo's thoughts to come to a halt while, in the background of his mind, he could hear shattering glass. "Are you what they call a tsundere?" she asked. "Because Mr. Midoriya is mine." And, with that, the girl closed the door right in Bakugo's face. As time went on, Izuku's presence at school was sporadic, to put it lightly. Entire weeks would go by with the green-haired teen's seat being vacant. Then, out of the blue, he would appear in class still looking like death had its scythe to his neck before then becoming absent the following day. When he did show up, the green-haired teen was not met with any empathy from his classmates. Instead, the mocking laughter returned, asking how he could ever be a hero when he could barely make it to class. Thankfully, his studies did not suffer too much as Izuku studied like never before, using it to distract from the constant pain he felt. And whenever Bakugo or one of his female classmates brought him a stack of assignments, Izuku poured every bit of his strength into completing them. The mockery from his class ended one day when one of the other guys in his class came to deliver Izuku's homework. This young man had never expected in a million years to see a maid like Toru opening the door with a cheerful smile, as his eyes trailed down from her face towards Toru's chest. Izuku's classmate couldn't believe that such a lovely maid was looking after the quirkless loser, and when he left, he had to tell everyone about this. Thus, after that day, whenever their homeroom teacher asked for a volunteer to drop off stuff to Izuku, there was usually a fight amongst the guys. This eventually led to some interesting situations. "Come on man," said Naga, the teen grinding his teeth as he spared to glance away from his comrade in crime to look up and down the walkway. "Hey, don't rush me," snapped Aoki as he knelt in front of the door leading into the Midoriya residence. His eyes were focused on his work, tongue sticking out slightly as his hands moved the tools that would pick the lock on the door. Though, despite what he said, the teen knew he had to move a little quicker. There was only so long the two of them could be seen on this walkway in their Aldridge AR. High uniforms before someone because suspicious. "Man, this better be worth it," said Naga as he continued to keep a lookout. If a hero or officer spotted them, the first thing they would wonder was why were those boys not in school before approaching them. "Are you sure she lives here with the quirkless freak?" "Pretty sure," responded Aoki. "I've been checking this place out. That maid never leaves at the end of the night, meaning she's most likely a live-in maid. Man, I wonder what cup size she is. Probably D or bigger," Naga said, a smile creeping onto his face. "We'll figure it out after we nab some of her bras and panties. Man, we are going to be legends after we show them to the guys at school. Not to mention trashing that hero nerd's room." Hey, Aoki half yelled, shooting a glare at Naga. "Check the goods out first. We might be able to sell some of that stuff on eBay for some serious cash." That got a laugh out of the two. Little did the two delinquents know that both Izuku and Toru were seated in the living room, their heads turned towards the door with exasperated expressions on their faces. Both the dragon maid and her master could hear everything that was being said by the two, who were both too close to the door and not being as quiet as they should be. Izuku, who was propped up on the couch waiting for his bed sheets to finish drying the old-fashioned way, let out an annoyed sigh at what his classmates were planning before reaching off to the side where he foam lay. But, before he could call the cops, Toru stood. "There's no need to trouble yourself, Mr. Midoriya," she said while tilting her head to the side and smiling. "Allow me to take care of this minor inconvenience." "Okay," said Izuku, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. As soon as he said that, Toru grinned wickedly as flames seemed to dance around her. Her mouth opened, revealing the wickedly sharp fangs, while her eyes now held a bloodthirsty look. As she raised one of her hands, the fingers becoming sharpened claws underneath the fabric of the gloves, Toru promised that she would make them pay. Not just for the slight that these pitiful, inferior humans planned to do onto her, but for insulting Mr. Midoriya. For that grave sin, she would see them both flung into the deepest bowels of hell before she personally sliced through their souls. Then she would. "Just don't kill them," added Izuku after a moment, not even bothering to open his tired eyes. At his words, Toru deflated back into her normal human appearance. Fine, Toru said, sounding disappointed as she walked towards the door with her back slumped. At the same time, Aoki grinned when he heard the familiar click of the lock being open. Giving a thumbs up to his classmate, He stood up while holding onto his lock-picking kit in one hand while the other went to his back pocket to pull out a mask. Seeing this, Naga did the same. However, before either of them could put on the masks, the door to the apartment opened. Normally, in a situation like this, the teens would have to quickly choose between one of three options: talk their way out of the situation, overpower the person standing before them, or just run. Yet what they saw caused all of the mental processes to come to a grinding halt. There, filling the entire hallway before them, was a dragon's head. It stared at them, blinking with one of those weird dual eyelids that they learned about in class but never really paid attention to. Then it roared. The force behind the noise was so powerful that it pushed them backwards, their backs pressing against the railing as droplets of spit the size of ping-pong balls collided with their faces. When it was over, the two terrified teens ran screaming as Toru closed the door. Later that day, Toru heard an interesting rumor from some of the other tenants. Apparently, two middle school students had run up to a police officer saying there was a monster living in the building. While at first the officer was alarmed by just how frightened and panicked the two were, he eventually noticed the masks the boys had in their hands as well as a lock-picking kit. Both of the students were then detained on suspicion while the police checked security footage, finding both of them trying to break into an apartment, though they did not find any monster. A few weeks later, Izuku found himself dragging his feet home after one of his rare returns to school. Despite having the strength to go in today, his skin was still ghostly pale and he had suffered various temperature flashes throughout the day. One moment he would be sitting there, shivering from head to toe as he felt like he was standing in the middle of a blizzard wearing only his boxers. Then, in the blink of an eye, he felt like he was standing next to a lava flow wearing his heaviest winter clothing. At the very least he hadn't vomited ... yet, as the people on the street gave Izuku room. Most likely out of the desire not to catch whatever he had, the teen briefly wanted to reconsider calling Toru and asking for her help getting home. However, that idea was quickly squashed since he was still mad at her for the heart attack she had given him yesterday. Honestly, things had been going pretty well with Toru. Every day, she was understanding more about this world and using the tools man had made. Yet, there were times when she slipped up. Yesterday had been one of those times. Toru had been doing laundry, briefly holding one of Izuku's shirts as she stared at it while panting. It looked like she was about to put it in her mouth again until she noticed Izuku standing on the opposite side of the room, staring at her as he used the wall beside him for support. Thankfully, Toru backtracked on her odd desire to clean his clothing in that fashion and instead opted to let them fresh air dry. The only problem was that it was cloudy, meaning it was bound to take longer. Her solution: leaning out the window before firing off 3 or 4 dragon breath lasers right into the clouds, clearing the sky instantly. How could Izuku not have a heart attack, fearing that she might have hit a plane and become a villain? Maybe I'm being a little too harsh with her, relented Izuku. I'll just talk to her again. Tell her that I just don't want to see her getting in any trouble. It was then that he noticed something odd up the street. It was a little girl, most likely an elementary student, with white lavender hair that was tied into pigtails. Her attire seemed a bit off as it wasn't something he regularly saw. Instead, she had on a white capelet with a fur collar, a pink blouse, a frilly white skirt, and pink shoes that one would normally find on a Western-style doll. Though what made her really stand out were the horns on her head along with a tail that had what appeared to be a ball of fluff at its end. To make matters stranger, the girl was walking up to random people and objects, giving them a brief sniff before moving on to the next. Something about her appearance and behavior set off alarm bells in Izuku's mind, that this girl might be from the same place that Toru came from. But what were the odds? For all he knew, all of this could be explained away as part of her quirk. Then, the little girl spotted him. She stared at the freckled-faced teen for a moment before speed walking over to his direction, grabbing his pants leg before sniffing. "You smell like Lady Toru," said the girl when she finished, looking up at Izuku with those big eyes. For a moment, Izuku stood there as whatever color he had left vanished completely, leaving him as pale as a ghost. Then, he realized something. This little girl had been able to tell he was close to someone just by smelling him, even going as far as calling out the dragon maid by name. What's more, this little girl had gone as far as giving Toru the title of lady. Had he been right? Was she another dragon? "Well, began Izuku, hoping to figure things out in a civilized manner. However, before he could, the little girl began pounding her tiny fists against his chest. "Let Lady Toru go," she yelled at the top of her lungs, drawing the attention of several people passing by. "I can smell her all over you. You seduced her into staying here, you ... playboy." Incubus. Adrenaline quickly began pumping through Izuku's system, the color returning to his body as it did while the teen made a quick decision. He grabbed the little girl. Somehow he managed to hold her under his arm as he ran down the street at full speed. All the while the little girl continued to beat her hands onto his chest, legs flailing about. Oddly enough, the blows didn't feel all that powerful. In fact, he could barely feel them. That's odd, thought Izuku, his mind analyzing this as he ran. I've seen what Toru can do with just a flick of her finger. These blows, they should have broken my rib cage and turned my bones into powder. Is she messing around? No, she seems like she's trying to escape from. Wait a minute, I just kidnapped her. Oh no, am I a villain? Quickly glancing around, Izuku noticed that while some people were watching him now, none of them were doing anything else. Wishing to keep it that way, Izuku placed a hand over the child's mouth, hoping to stop her from making more of a fuss. Listen, I'm not a bad guy, said Izuku in a hushed voice. I'm not kidnapping you for any villainous purposes, just taking you to see Toru. So could you please calm down? Izuku was then cut off as the girl's mouth opened wider than what would have been considered normal to most, revealing razor-sharp teeth that dug into the teen's skin. Thankfully, the run to the apartment wasn't that far, as he had only been a block and a half away. Panting, Izuku soon opened the door to his apartment with the little girl in tow. The green-haired boy had his good hand pressed against the wall, using it to steady himself while his other hand was covered in his own blood while dripping blood onto the floor. Thankfully, knowing Toru, she could clean all this off with a little bit of magic. Welcome home, Mr. Midoriya, said Toru as she came to greet them. I trust you had. Her eyes then widened when they fell on his hand, ending her cheerful expression in less than a heartbeat. Mr. Midoriya, what fool has dared to harm you? I shall rip out their still beating heart and crush it before their eyes for this offense. Izuku then noticed her eyes darting towards something behind him. It was pretty clear that she had noticed the little girl now, and that seemed to make Toru even more angry. Mr. Midoriya, are you cheating on me? I will crush this little floozy with. Thankfully, the girl stepped out from behind Izuku at that moment, causing Toru's anger to instantly vanish. Lady Toru, cried the girl as she raced to embrace the dragon maid. Toru just continued to blink in shock as the little girl's arms wrapped around her. Kana, was all Toru could say. Mr. Midoriya, where did you find her? And Mr. Midoriya, I forgot you're hurt. Izuku just gave a weak smile at that, ready to wave it off as nothing since Toru was in the middle of what seemed like a heartfelt reunion. But before he could tell her it was nothing and would just bandage the wound himself, the dragon maid was upon him. Grabbing the upper arm connected to his bleeding hand, she brought him to the living room to rest for a moment as she searched for a first aid kit. It took her several minutes and several crashes to find it. When she did, she returned to Izuku's side, where she then knelt down to begin dressing his wound. All the while, Kana was giving the green-haired human the stink eye. So, I take it you know each other, began Izuku, doing his best to break the ice. Yep, chirped Toru as she finished cleaning the blood off his hand, thankfully not licking it off. This girl's name is Kana Kamui. She's an acquaintance of mine. It's nice to meet you, said Izuku warmly. However, Kana just continued to sit across from him on the floor, still giving her host the stink eye. Lady Toru just vanished one day, said Kana after a moment of silence, her eyes shifting over to the maid. No one has seen or heard from her in some time. As the younger dragon said this, Izuku felt the urge to ask Toru why. If she had people, dragons who cared about her, the least she should have done was to let them know she was all right. However, when he looked down at her, Izuku noticed that Toru had lowered her head slightly while her eyes seemed to be unfocused, like she was lost in her own thoughts and memories. As he looked at his maid, Izuku remembered that night they had first met, how wounded she had been, left alone, how she had said she didn't have a home to go back to, that she didn't belong anywhere. Did she think that, because of whatever happened to her, that no dragon would help her? Or was it something else? Regardless, this wasn't a subject that Toru wanted to talk about. He knew the feeling. Izuku was willing to bet he had the same look on his face whenever his mother asked him why he had burn marks on his clothing during his early childhood. He didn't want to voice how the person he had always viewed as amazing had been treating him, not wanting to hear how he shouldn't hang out with Kaken. So, he did what he had done back then, change the subject. So Kana, began Izuku, gaining both girls' attention. Why were you wandering the streets sniffing things? Were you looking for Toru? That earned him an affirmative nod from the white-haired girl. Yes, I saw the blast that cleared the clouds and sensed her magic, she said. That helped me narrow down where she could be. After that, I decided I should try picking up her scent. So you were just sniffing everything hoping you could find her? Asked Izuku. Yes, said Kana again before a disgusted look appeared on her face. She then began holding her nose as if thinking about something brought back the phantom scent of the thing. Your world has many weird people. Her attention then shifted back to Toru. Lady Toru, why are you dressed like that? Please, come home with me. I need you. I can't, said Toru in a sad yet firm tone. Then, in the blink of an eye, her tone shifted into her normally energetic one as she gestured to Izuku. Because I have fallen head over heels for Mr. Midoriya, and am helping him become a dragon. TOHRU, yelled Izuku, his face turning scarlet at the dragon's proclamation. I knew it, exclaimed Kana, standing up. Izuku quickly turned to look at Toru, hoping that he could get her to say something to calm the situation down. However, the maid was off in her own little world. Her hands were on her cheeks, a giggle that might have been perverted escaping her mouth as drool leaked from the edges. He then looked back at the younger dragon girl, finding a purple aura of malice surrounding her. He could hear her mumbling something like "I knew it" and a few other choice words that really shouldn't come from anyone that looks that young. Then, a thought came to him. "Is the reason you need Toru's help because you're weak?" asked Izuku with a finger raised. Kana's shock at being called out like that was so powerful that everyone in the apartment could hear glass shattering. "What gives you that idea, Mr. Midoriya?" asked Toru, who had calmed down, now shooting questioning looks between Izuku and Kana. While Midoriya was still sitting there with his good hand on his chin looking thoughtful, Kana looked to be sweating bullets as her face paled. "Well, when I brought Kana here, she was struggling to free herself," replied Izuku, earning a gasp from Toru. "She was kicking up a storm and punching my chest the entire time. Yet they barely had any power in them. And now that I think of it, I think being bitten by a dragon should have taken my hand clean off even if she was in her human form." Izuku then tilted his head as a new thought came to him. "Maybe she's not eating right. Kana, how long have you been here?" When Izuku looked over at the younger of the two dragons, he almost did a double take when he noticed that Kana had turned around so as to not face either of them. "Not my fault," she managed to mumble. "Lady Toru is special. This place has low mana purity." A pit began to form in Izuku's stomach as some of the pieces to this puzzle were coming together. Kana wanted to leave this world but lacked the power to do so, hence why she sought out Toru. However, why was she here in the first place? She had admitted it herself that no one knew where Toru was, so why go looking for her in another world? So, if it wasn't that, then why was she here? Had some human banished her to this world to save their kingdom, making her someone else's problem? Or had it been some sort of sick dragon hunter, sending dragons to another world where they would be as helpless as a literal child? The explanation Izuku got was not what he was expecting. Apparently, Kana liked to play pranks in order to get her parents' attention. So one day, after a prank went a little too far, her parents sent her to this world in order to reflect on her action. Much like how some parents will kick their children out of the house. Yet, there seemed to be no signs that her parents were watching her, nor did she seem to have any means to contact them. "Could you take her back?" asked Izuku, as he continued to process what he had heard. He knew what it was like to live all alone with your family so far away. However, there were some major differences. His mother had wanted Izuku to come with her to America and live with a man whose face he couldn't even remember. But he had refused, stating he still wanted to try and get into UA. While his mother never believed in this dream, she had relented and was still sending him money to live, which was far more than what Kana's parents were doing. "Sadly, it would be no use," replied Toru with a shake of her head. "If her parents are determined to have Kana reflect on her actions, they would no doubt just send her right back to Earth. So it would be pointless to even try." Nodding in understanding, Izuku turned to look at Kana to see something that made his heart clench. The little dragon girl just sat there, crying as all hope left her eyes. In that instant, Izuku found himself back on that roof with the one hope he had walking away. "So, would you like to stay here?" he asked. There was no way Izuku would ever allow someone to go through what he had. To have your last hope crushed before being left on that metaphorical roof all alone. That was something that was far too painful for anyone to go through, especially a young girl. In return, Kana just stared at him dumbly, though some of the light in her eyes began to slowly return. "Why, you're trying to deceive me," she said. "This is some sort of trick." "Not at all," said Izuku with the shake of his head. "If you want, you can stay here with me and Toru for as long as you need to. No strings attached. Just, don't let people around here know you're a real dragon." Seeing the light returning to Kana's eyes, he held out his hand while smiling warmly. The next thing Izuku knew, Kana had moved past his outstretched hand before wrapping her arms around his body to begin crying into his pant leg. "Just remember, Mr. Midoriya belongs to me," added Toru. "All right class, settle down," came the voice belonging to Bakugo's homeroom teacher as he entered the room. As the rest of the extras in class stopped making so much damned noise, Bakugo remained as he was, leaning back on his seat, arms folded in back of his head. His eyes were closed, knowing that whatever the man was about to spew would be barely worth his time. The explosive teen knew his grades were top of his class, already knew all of the upcoming events, so whatever this man was about to say would be white noise for him. There was only one exception. No doubt he would be begging the class to drop off assignments to that shitty nerd Deku. "First off, as of today, Izuku Midoriya will no longer be with us," said the teacher, his voice sounding only mildly happy. No doubt glad to not have to pull teeth trying to get someone to deliver assignments to the quirkless student. As the majority of the class seemed to adopt an about-time attitude, Bakugo sat up straight in his seat. "What does that mean?" roared the teen, his eyes wide. "It means that Izuku Midoriya is no longer a student at this class," replied the teacher offhandedly. "That was all I was told." And with that, the man went on discussing other things. Not that Bakugo was paying any attention to that, as an almost alien emotion filled him. so alien that Bakugo didn't know what he was feeling as he glanced over at Deku's empty seat. The green-haired nerd had been the one constant in his life, like a shadow that no matter what he did he couldn't get rid of. Bakugo had always believed with his whole heart he would be glad for the day he would no longer have to deal with Deku. That when he went to UA, he would never see that mess of green hair or hear the name Kaken ever again. Well, until the shitty nerd found himself in trouble and Bakugo was the hero saving his worthless ass. But now that it had happened so suddenly, as Bakugo continued to stare at the desk, he couldn't help but wonder what had happened. Was it Deku's illness? Had it finally become so bad that he was taken to a hospital? Or had he been sent away to a specialist? Movement in his peripheral vision caught Bakugo's attention, turning his head slightly. He noticed that he wasn't the only one looking at the desk. The two extras that followed him around, the ones who had been there when he had thrown Deku's notebook out the window, were looking at the desk as well. However, their faces seemed to have paled. They also seemed to look worried. It wasn't until their eyes met that Bakugo realized what they were thinking, causing the ashen blonde to turn and look away. No way, he thought to himself, grabbing a hold of his pencil before squeezing it. He wasn't worried or anything like that. Heck no, the pencil was just pissing him off. That's why he was squeezing it like he was trying to wring its non-existent neck. There's no way Deku would jump. Not after all this, unless they told him he was never going to get better, or that whatever the fuck he has will put him 6 feet under. Meaning that, Bakugo's eyes then suddenly widened as he realized where this train of thought was going. Grinding his teeth, the angry teen increased the pressure on his pencil, causing it to snap in two. What the fuck am I thinking about? That shitty nerd has gotten bad news since he was 4. There's no way he would take his life now. His mom probably finally dragged his unconscious ass with her to the States. With that, Bakugo took a deep breath as he slowly began to feel more like his old overconfident and angry self, mostly because he had just destroyed his last pencil. However, despite that, Bakugo found himself walking over to the Midoriya apartment one last time after school to find it empty to his shock. At that same moment, Izuku Midoriya was walking out of his room within his new apartment, having just finished putting away the last of his All Might merchandise. Slowly he stepped into the combination of living, dining, kitchen, which honestly made the place feel more open. To his side was a sliding door that led out to a balcony, something his old apartment didn't have. During the day, it would allow for more sunlight to shine in. Well, that as well as allowing the girls living with him to exit that way via turning into dragons if the need ever arose. As Izuku moved to sit on the couch, next to Kana with Toru humming happily in the kitchen, he was glad he had made the decision to move. While his old apartment held so many memories, both good and bad, it was feeling a bit cramped for the three of them to be living there. The kitchen, for example, had been fine back when it had just been Izuku and his mother sitting across from each other. It was the same when it was just him and Toru. But with Kana now living with them, it just felt more cramped. Same with the living room. So, after a few days of recovering, Izuku and the two disguised dragons went to a real estate office to see if they could find something a bit bigger within their budget. And after several attempts, the trio settled on an apartment whose building had a community roof that the girls seemed to really enjoy. As Kana turned on the television to watch an anime, a weird one about a tanuki trying to take pictures of a fox girl, Izuku watched along with her, though his attention was a tad more focused on how well this was going to work out. Other than the community roof, both Toru and Kana got a larger room for themselves to share. Speaking of Toru, she was delighted to discover that this location was closer to an outdoor shopping district that she really liked. As for Izuku, he will be finishing his middle school education at a new school. He only hoped that it would be pleasant. Izuku quickly discovered that his new middle school was much friendlier than what he was used to. It was a shocking experience to see so many people asking if he was okay when he brought up the fact that his health had been on the decline for most of the year. No one asked what was going on with him or about his quirk, Izuku theorizing that they were afraid that his quirk was the source of his health issues. As for Kana, she decided to go to elementary school herself. There she quickly became friends with a girl named Satsuki Asui, the younger sister of his classmate Tsuyu. Because of this, Tsu was the one to always deliver Midoriya's schoolwork to him whenever he was feeling sick. That as well as allowing him to copy her notes as they sat at the kitchen table, the two younger children playing as they did so. This somewhat bothered Toru. "I will agree to allow you into our home as you are a classmate of my master," began Toru in a sweet tone before her eyes narrowed. "However, if you plan on stealing him from me, I shall boil you in oil and feast upon your soul." Okay, if that bothered the frog girl, she didn't show it. And so, Izuku continued to live with his new makeshift family. As time went by, the negative effects of Toru's tale began to lessen. He found himself in a lot less pain after consuming it, able to sleep without incident. What's more, the normally timid teen celebrated the fact that he was calling off from school far less. No longer was he missing a week of school here and there, but only a day or two a week. That soon turned into missing classes once or twice every other week. Then, eventually, the biggest day of Izuku's life arrived. The morning of the UA entrance exam, Toru was in the kitchen, frying up some bacon with chunks of her tail meat mixed in while a nice stack of pancakes was piled up on the counter near her. As the dragon maid worked, happily singing to herself as she did, Kana sat at the table drinking her orange juice while her own breakfast plate lay before her half finished. "Lady Toru," said the younger dragon after she set out her glass, "won't Izuku be late if he doesn't hurry up?" You're right," said Toru as she glanced over at the digital clock. Turning around, the dragon maid brought her hands up to her mouth before yelling out, "Mr. Midoriya, you better hurry or you'll be late for the exam." A loud crash could then be heard coming Izuku's room. At first, the maid paid it no mind, humming to herself as she listened to the various thuds and muffled muttering coming from her master's room over the sizzling of the skillet. Honestly, there was a part of her that hoped that he would be running late so that she could offer to let him ride her to school. But a sudden loud crack caused Toru to jump where she stood in a panic. Quickly turning around, Toru saw what had happened. It seemed that, due to his hurry, Izuku had tried to open the door while forgetting to turn the knob. This was something that had happened before, mainly whenever there was live footage of the blonde-haired human who hurt her master appeared on the news. Now it had happened again. Only, this time, Mr. Midoriya didn't slam his head into the door or anything like that. No, the door had been torn off its hinges with the green-haired teen still holding it up by the knob like it was nothing. "Ooh," exclaimed Kana, hands on her cheeks as Toru began to dance giddily in place. "Toru, what's happening?" asked Izuku, his gaze shifting between the door still in his grasp, to the dragon maid, and then back to the door. As panic appeared in his face, Midoriya suddenly dropped the door, looking at it like it were some wild beast that would strike him if he didn't make some distance between them. "Oh, Mr. Midoriya, it looks like the transformation will be finished soon," exclaimed Toru as she zipped across the apartment to wrap her master in an embrace, one that forced his head to become nestled between her breasts, causing him to blush bright red. "I'd say you'll become a full dragon any day now." "Really?" asked Izuku after he managed to pull away from Toru. Not that she seemed to mind, seeing as the moment he was free the dragon girl brought her hands together while swaying from side to side. The teen only took that in for a moment as he looked down at himself. He seemed, well, rather normal. Maybe a bit thicker in the arms and legs, but that was it. His skin hadn't turned any different color nor had scales appeared. There were no additional limbs like a tail, and he hadn't noticed his shirt getting caught on any horns. Heck, he hadn't even breathed fire last night when Toru had made him extra spicy chili with dragon tail meat mixed in. "Doesn't seem like it," he eventually as he finally lowered his arms. "Shouldn't there have been more changes before this? Like getting stronger gradually or my body changing over time?" "Nope," replied Toru in a giddy tone. "All the changes start once the process is near completion and you're no longer going to die. First, your body starts getting stronger, building as time goes by until the body undergoes a sudden magical transformation where you leave behind your former pitiful self for the superior form of the dragon you." "I've never seen it, but it's supposed to be wicked," added Kana simply from the kitchen. "But until then, I suggest that you be careful," advised Toru as she dragged Izuku over to the kitchen table. Once he was seated, the blonde dragon girl continued to talk as she served him his meal. "Your strength will be in a constant state of flux as it continues to grow stronger. Simple things like opening doors will constantly take a bit more concentration. Well, unless you wanted to destroy those poorly constructed objects. Seriously, whoever thought to make them out of such flimsy material?" With that, Izuku went to eat his meal while a still gushing Toru went to fix the door using her magic. Despite eating his meal at a rapid pace, practically shoveling the food into his mouth, 𝗬 arrived before he could finish. Thankfully, Toru was still in such a good mood that she politely asked the frog girl to wait just a moment without any threats or outright hostility towards another girl entering the domain. If 𝗬 was alarmed by this, she didn't show it as she simply stood there while letting out small ribbits as she waited for her friend. Once he was finished, Izuku gave a quick goodbye to both dragons before heading out the door. "Have you put on more muscle since yesterday?" asked 𝗬 before the door closed. Oh my, such an impressive variety of applicants this year," said 𝗬𝗬, the chimera-like creature who ran UA as its principal, as the practical part of the entrance exam was gearing up to begin. As 𝗬𝗬 took a long sip of his tea, along with several other staff members, sat in a dark room lit only by the many monitors within. Several of the larger screens covered the wall before them, showing the mass of students as they stood in front of the various training areas where the exams were to take place. "I hardly know which screen deserves my full focus. Wouldn't you? All Might, is everything okay?" Lowering the teacup from his mouth, 𝗬𝗬 glanced over at the slender figure of the #1 hero. Said man's gaze was focused downward at the armrest of each seat was a smaller monitor that allowed the person sitting there the option to focus on a particular student should they catch a hero's attention. Now, normally there wouldn't be anything odd about this. However, it was unusual for a teacher to do this before the exam had even begun. Even more unusual was the deep frown on the symbol of Peace's face as he stared at one student in particular. But upon hearing the principal's voice, the man seemed to snap out of it. "Sorry about that, 𝗍𝗂," All Might said awkwardly. "I was surprised to see someone taking the exam." Curious, 𝗍𝗂 quickly pulled up the same image. Now on his own personal screen was a green-haired young man with diamond-shaped freckles on his face. He seemed a little plain to the unidentifiable mammal, even as he stretched his limbs. With only a few taps on his screen, 𝗍𝗂 brought up the examinee's profile. "And what has this Mr. Midoriya done to earn such a frown from you?" asked 𝗍𝗂 as he began to skim the file rapidly. "Surely he doesn't have a criminal record, or else he would have been barred from taking the exam." The slender man didn't answer right away. Taking in a deep breath before speaking, he asked if a quirkless person like himself could ever be a hero. Naturally, I told him no. Given how he reacted, I had assumed that he had taken my words to heart and had given up on this foolish desire of his. But it seems I was wrong. 𝗍𝗂 made a small noise as he picked up his cup, keeping one eye on All Might as he sipped his tea. Oh, how time and injuries change a person. There was once a time when this man would have focused more on the spirit of the young man, praising him for trying even when the chips were down. But now, with his powers waning from the injury All for One gave him, he had become far more jaded. It was a sad sight to see, especially to those who knew of the great hero's origin. "Well, there is nothing in the rules saying that he can't at least try," replied 𝗍𝗂 diplomatically. All Might just shook his head, his long blonde locks waving as he did. It was a mistake to change the rules to allow the quirkless a chance at entering the hero course. It only gives them false hope. When this exam is over, I'll be sure to scold him for endangering himself. 𝗍𝗂 was thankful that his teacup hid his frown. Over in the testing areas, Izuku was stretching his limbs while doing his best to keep calm the way he knew best, examining quirks. There were just so many around him, with some of the students even having specialized equipment to help them. His fingers itched, wishing that he had his notebook to take notes and make sketches. That is until he noticed a familiar face glancing disapprovingly in his direction. Izuku slightly wilted under the gaze of the tall, blue-haired, bespectacled teen. It was less than an hour ago that their very brief interaction had occurred. Izuku had been sitting in the massive auditorium next to 𝗧𝗏, listening to Present Mic as the hero gave them the lowdown on how the practical would play out. Simply put, there were 3 different types of robots spread out over a cityscape that the school provided. Students would gain points based on the type of robot they destroyed. It was during this time that the blue-haired teen had a question, his voice already sounding irritated. An irritation that only seemed to grow after he had been allowed to speak, pointing out on the documents that they had all been given that there are 4 types of robots listed, and demanded if this was a mistake. Then, before Present Mic could answer, the teen had spun to the side to point out Midoriya, as he had apparently been muttering under his breath during the entire explanation. "Has it really been that bad?" Izuku had whispered to 𝗧𝗏, leaning close in the hopes that nobody could hear. "Not really, Ribbit," 𝗧𝗏 whispered back. "Maybe he's just nervous." Back in the present, Izuku noticed the blue-haired teen marching over to him with a frown on his face. Yet before he could take more than a few steps, the massive gates suddenly opened to the surprise of all the students there. For several seconds, they all stood there in stunned silence as they were unsure of what to do. "Hey, hey, hey," came the loud voice of Present Mic. Looking up at where the voice was coming from, the students saw the blonde-haired man standing on top of the gates with a savage smile on his face. "Why are all you little listeners wasting time? There are no countdowns in real life. The exam has already started." As soon as he heard that, Izuku took off running along with the rest of the examinees. Yet it felt odd to him that, while he was keeping pace with them, it felt to him like a light jog. Like he could go faster, much faster. At the same time, Izuku felt his skin beginning to itch like crazy, but he managed to ignore it for now. It took a few more seconds before spotting the first group of robots. Several of the 2-pointers surrounding a 3-pointer. All of them faced the onrush of student hopefuls, ready to attack once they were close enough. Desiring to see what he could do after 10 months of eating Toru's tail, Izuku decided to increase his speed to its max. When he did, his senses must have kicked in, because he did not see the world around him as anything like a blur. Rather, he perceived everything as if it were nearly standing still. Before he knew it, he was in front of one of the 2-pointers with his fist pulled back. Then he struck as time seemed to resume around him. The effect of his punch was beyond anything he had expected. Not only had the robot been destroyed, but the winds he generated also blew away the other robots. Even the heavy 3-pointer was lifted off the ground as it was flung into a wall. Izuku stood there, his arm outstretched as wisps of smoke rose off his knuckles. Around him, the other students' jaws nearly dropped. And who could blame them? This seemingly ordinary, plain-looking boy had just destroyed a whole group of robots like he was the second coming of All Might. As for Izuku, he just stood there with his eyes wide as he continued to process what he had just done. Then, panic began to set in as he surveyed all the damage he had just caused. He had all this strength but didn't know how to control it. That was bad, really bad. If he tried punching another robot like that with other students around, he might end up hurting them by accident. So, after glancing around, Izuku decided to make a break for it and find a more secluded area. Back with the teachers, all of them had seen what Izuku Midoriya had done as his score shot up. Several of them were standing in amazement, their eyes glued to the screen. "That level of strength is mighty impressive for such youngin," said Snipe with a loud hoot. "I'd say that kid there might even give All Might a run for his money someday." "It is impressive," added Midnight as she leaned back in her seat, a thoughtful expression replacing her normally seductive expression. "Though I wonder why he's running around like that." That's when a figure in black saved the white scarf around his neck, pushed himself off the wall he had been leaning against to get a little closer to the screen. As he spoke, "It's pretty obvious that he doesn't have full control over his strength," said Aizawa in a tired tone, his eyes never once leaving the image before him of the green-haired teen. If you were looking at his face, you could see that he was surprised by the amount of devastation a single punch could do. Not surprising given the irrational stances on quirk usage. However, he's not letting that stop him. At that moment, the screen showed a robot coming after Midoriya. The boy looked at it, bringing a fist up ready to destroy it, only to then run in the opposite direction. Seeing this brought a smile to Aizawa's face. "See that there?" continued the underground pro as he gestured to what else was on the screen. "He didn't punch that robot because he spotted people close by. People who would have been swept up in the windstorm a single punch would make. That or would have been showered in chunks of metal. It was a rational decision on the boy's part." Nezu nodded, having spotted the same young men and women who would have been in the path of destruction created by Midoriya had he attacked. An act that, had he carried through, would have cost him the exam. Instead, he was picking his battles, attacking only when he could see that there was no one else around. And while this wasn't giving him the highest score, it was the right mindset for a potential hero. "He told me he was quirkless." Nezu's ears perked at All Might's words, barely above that of a whisper. The principal turned to look at the man, finding his head down to watch his own personal screen. Though his messy blonde hair hid his face, Nezu could see the way he gripped the arms rests of his chair as well as the tone of his voice. Was he lying? No, his posture screamed insecure. That look of dejection. There was no way he could have faked it. So how did he become so strong? "It's impossible for someone other than myself to give him a quirk. And since I still have one for all, then ... Oh no. Oh god no. I killed him. But it's the only thing that makes sense. He survived." Meanwhile, back in the exam area, Izuku continued to make his way through the false city in search of more robots. However, this was easier said than done as, while he had found plenty of foe villains to destroy, the other examinees had been too close. At one point he found a cross-section of the street where dozens of UA hopefuls were just trashing the robots while calling out their scores. Thus he had been forced to run around the area like a chicken with its head cut off, hoping to find the center of the city empty. Izuku began heading in that direction when a sudden rumbling caused him to skid to a halt. The ground then shook violently as a machine referred to as a 0-pointer rose from the ground. A machine they had been told was worth no points, meant more as an obstacle that should be avoided at all costs. For a moment, Izuku saw his big chance. Everyone was running away from the robot. He could take full advantage of this to search for more 1, 2, and 3-point robots within the city while everyone headed to its edges. Grinning happily, he began to turn until a cry for help caught his ear. It didn't take the teen long to find its source. There, lying on the ground, was a brown-haired girl with rosy cheeks. She clawed and scraped at the ground, looking over her shoulder at both her legs, which were pinned to the ground by a mountain of rubble, as well as the looming figure of the 0-pointer. Anger began to bubble in Izuku's chest and heart as he watched the others flee, some even looking back at the girl only to continue to run. No one was trying to help her. No one was willing to save her. Feeling his canines beginning to grow in his mouth, Izuku let out a howl of rage before taking off. The world around him turned bright red for a moment before the color shifted to green, a glow that he later realized emanated from his own body as it began to shift. The teen's body began to grow rapidly, clothing ripping to shreds in the process while his skin turned both scaly and green. Nails transformed, becoming thick black claws that dug into the street below him as easily as wet clay. When it was over and the light faded, a massive green Western-style dragon stood in his place. His large, bat-like wings were easily as massive as Canis, and around his head was something like a lion's mane of the same color. But Izuku paid no heed to his new form as he flew right into the 0-pointer. Its metal arms tried to grab Izuku, pry him off, and toss him away. But Izuku's claws dug into its metal shell like it was wet cardboard, his fangs biting into the robot's neck as they both fell backward. The dragon teen bit down hard with all his might, the metal neck snapping in an instant. As the 0-pointer lay there, Izuku stood upon its lifeless corpse as though it were his hoard. Wings extended, Midoriya let out a cry that sounded like that of a Tyrannosaurus Rex from the old pre-quirk Jurassic Park movies. Everyone around paused to watch the sight before them. Then, the exam was called and Izuku's green-slitted eyes became nothing more than white circular voids. His body began to shake and tremble for several long seconds until finally he looked down at the crowd. Can't seem to turn back. He asked in a booming yet panicked tone. Can someone please help me find my phone? I need to call for help. Everyone there felt their eyes twitch. It took a couple of minutes as the brown-haired girl, along with a few others who were healed after recovery girl arrived at the scene, searched for the missing phone. In the end, it was the teen with the engines coming out of his legs that found it. Almost sheepishly, the teen asked Izuku who to call. Go to home in my contact list, said Izuku, relief in his voice that a guy had found his phone. If there was one thing that he had learned by this point was that Toru would jump to some pretty insane conclusions whenever he was found around someone of the opposite sex. A woman named Toru should answer it. At that, the teen nodded. After unlocking the phone, a password that Izuku would be changing after he turned back to normal, the blue-haired teen almost instantly found the number he was looking for. And, after just 2 rings, it was answered. Hello, Midoriya residence, came a cheerful and friendly voice. Hello, my name is Tenya Ida. I may be a little forward in asking this, but is your name Toru? Asked the now-named Ida. It is, came Toru's reply. Thank you, said Ida with stiff politeness. The reason for this call is that there is an unusual situation here at the UA testing grounds. The person who told me to call you appears to have used his quirk to transform into a dragon but is having difficulty turning back. Has he not had enough practice with his quirk? Because, if so, it was however, his words fell on non-existent ears for the moment he mentioned Izuku turning into a dragon. Toru was off, opening the sliding balcony door with enough force that the glass shattered and the frame was flung towards the ocean. The dragon maid leapt into the air where she then transformed into a dragon. Instantly her perception magic took hold, hiding her from the sight of the humans below as she flew towards the school so fast that she created hurricane-level winds in her wake. Another instant later and she was at UA, bouncing giddily in her human form next to Ida who was still talking on the phone. Well, until the wind hit him. He, along with nearly all of the students taking the exam, were swept off the ground and flung down the streets. Seeing this, Izuku began waving his large claws in a panic but was too caught off guard to help many of them. As for Toru, she didn't seem to notice any of the destruction her actions caused. Instead, she had her hands holding her cheeks as she stared at Izuku with heart-shaped pupils. Oh my, giggled Toru, almost dancing with joy as she approached the dragon teen. I knew you would make a handsome dragon. It would be just a shame to turn you back to looking like an inferior human. Toru, hissed Izuku, his eyes darting over to the rest of the examinees. While most of them were struggling to get off the ground, a few even embedded in the wall like old Saturday morning cartoon characters, there were a few who had managed to stand, albeit on very shaky legs. Fine, sighed Toru, a look of annoyance appearing on her features as she raised a gloved hand. Just let me cast this spell and you'll look like your old self. With that, Toru snapped her fingers, causing a light to envelop Izuku once more. When it faded, he looked just like he had when he had left that morning. For the next couple of weeks, Izuku practiced magic with Toru and Kana as he waited for the test results to come in. The main thing he wanted to get down was the spell allowing him to turn from human to dragon and vice versa. And within a couple of days, he managed to get the hang of it. Mostly, he was having a bit of trouble hiding his new wings and his eyes still had the slit-like pupils. But other than that, he was handling things well. He also learned something else. Mr. Midoriya, I hate to tell you this, but even though you are now a dragon, you only have the strength of a newborn, Toru had told him one day after he had been feeling very confident in his progress. Even Kana is stronger than you. This naturally floored Izuku, his brain crashing as he tried to process this new information. During the exam, he felt like a demigod just based on what a swing of his arms could do. But to find out that he was considered weak among dragons, that even Kana was stronger than him, this became something the teen had learned thoroughly after the 3 of them had gone out to a wide field in the middle of nowhere for what they called some light roughhousing, more like a battle, now that Kana had managed to figure out how to restore her mana. Oddly enough, all she had to do was plug her tail into an electrical socket. She was able to fire beams of magical energy and do things that boggled the teen's mind. And when Izuku asked if he could join, Kana dodged everything he tried while kicking in his head so hard that he found himself deep underground. Yeah, he still had a long way to go. Then, one day, a knock came at their door. Coming, came Toru's voice as she left the kitchen. Izuku looked up from the kitchen table, Kana sitting across from him doing her homework while he helped to watch as his maid moved quickly across the apartment towards the door. Hello there, how may I help you? Asked Toru after opening the door. Oh my, is this the Midoriya residence? Izuku blinked at the high-pitched, unfamiliar voice. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors he knew as he had met them all. To the right of their apartment lived a kind woman who was always happy to share with them some of the extra food she made, though it was a little worrisome that they could all hear the rather loud noises she made while cooking. perhaps a part of her quirk. On the left was a strange man who was a musician of sorts. Both he and Toru had visited this man, finding that his idea of music seemed to be screaming into a microphone while screaming his head off with his tongue hanging out the entire time. But other than that, the man was chill. He even mentioned that his cousin, a girl by the name of 𝐭𝐲𝗫. Directly above them lived an old man whose quirk allowed him to turn his fingernails into small blades. With it he made a living carving wooden statues and selling them online. As for their last neighbor, she was a tall woman whose quirk gave her fox-like features as well as being a bit taller than normal. She was perhaps the shyest out of all Izuku's neighbors as well as the most timid. "Yes, this is," came Toru's voice, breaking Izuku out of his thoughts. "If you are here to see Mr. Midoriya, then please come inside. I'll make us some snacks. Would you like some tea as well?" "Tea would be lovely," said that high-pitched voice again. A moment later, a rather odd-looking animal in a suit entered the apartment, followed closely by a man in a trench coat. After greeting them, Izuku and Toru brought them both to the living room before serving some tea and chilled fruits. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku spotted the animal sniffing the air deeply but otherwise ignored it. "You have a simply wonderful little home here," said the creature as it sat in a chair they had provided for him. As for the man in the trench coat, he stood behind and slightly off to the side of the unknown animal. "Now, where are my manners? Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is 𝗫𝗬𝗂, principal of UA. The man behind me is 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗲, a good friend of mine." "It's a pleasure to meet you both," said Izuku, eyes wide as he stared at 𝗫𝗬𝗂. He had heard the rumors that UA was run by an animal with a quirk that made him super intelligent. However, he could never get his hands on any hard facts to back up any of the rumors. Oh, he was just dying to ask 𝗫𝗬𝗂 all sorts of questions for his notebooks. "Please forgive this surprise visit," continued 𝗫𝗬𝗂, something in his voice causing Izuku to halt his fanboying as he looked on at the creature with some trepidation. "However, there were some issues when it came to your letter regarding your admittance into our school. It has been a rather humiliating situation." "Delightful tea, by the way." As 𝗫𝗬𝗂 said this last part, he held up the teacup he had been sipping at as if to toast Toru. "Thank you," replied Toru, leaning to the side a bit with her hands behind her back. "I found it in this nice little shop in the shopping district. None of that instant stuff you find in those creepy department stores." 𝗫𝗂𝗂 nodded before sipping his tea slowly as if savoring the taste. "If you wouldn't mind, could you please write down the address?" he asked, eyes closed briefly while his body seemed to relax. "I would hate to allow such an amazing discovery to slip through my paws. However, such things will have to wait. Now, before I can tell Mr. Midoriya how he did on the exam, there seem to be a few glaring flaws on file. For example, you were stated to be quirkless, and yet, from what I saw during the practical shows, you clearly do have one." "Yeah, guess I'm a really late bloomer," said Izuku as he nervously scratched the back of his head. "I've been sick for most of the past year as my body began to adapt to this power." 𝗫𝗬𝗂 gave him a nod. "Yes, I am aware of the health issues you have suffered," replied 𝗫𝗬𝗂 with a nod. He then glanced over briefly at 𝗬𝗁𝐺, whose expression was stony. If that bothered 𝗫𝗬𝗂, he didn't show it as he turned back at Midoriya with a sympathetic smile. "Terribly sorry you went through that. Thankfully you had people around you to help take care of you." "Of course," exclaimed Toru as she placed a hand on her chest in an exaggerated motion. "As Mr. Midoriya's personal, lovely maid, it was my duty to take care of him with all the love I possess." 𝗫𝗬𝗂 nodded before continuing to ask questions. Like 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 was, as their records showed that Izuku was an only child. To which Izuku answered honestly that she was a friend of Toru's and he offered to allow her to live with them. And now they were like a sort of patchwork family that he appreciated with all his heart. Then, 𝗫𝗬𝗂 began asking his various questions which seemed meant to test his knowledge of quirks and villains. Finally, "So, in your humble opinion, what would you say is the strongest quirk out there?" asked 𝗫𝗬𝗂. Izuku hesitated for a moment, thinking as he tapped his chin. "I want to say All Might's quirk, since he is the greatest hero Japan, perhaps even the entire world, has ever seen. The problem is that nobody knows what his quirk does. Is it some sort of invulnerability quirk, a massive strength enhancement, or converting the damage he takes into physical power? So, with that said, I think Stars and Stripes' new order is probably the most powerful. I don't know all the details about it, but I do know that by using it she can give a command to whatever she touches." "I see," replied 𝗫𝗬𝗂 with a nod, understanding the boy's logic, no doubt also seeing just how uncomfortable he was by the simple act of not picking All Might. But what if there was a quirk out there that allowed one to steal quirks, use them at will, and give those stolen quirks to another? "Well, that would be scary," replied Izuku with a laugh. "Can you imagine what someone could do with a quirk like that? Good thing such a quirk doesn't exist." At that, 𝗬𝗁𝗁 leaned down to whisper in 𝗫𝗬𝗂's ear. The small mammal nodded before beaming a smile at Midoriya. "Well, I believe we have taken up enough of your time," said the principal of UA, as he reached into his pocket to produce several papers. "Please, allow me to personally congratulate you and welcome you into UA.